One of our personal favorite soundtracks of that era, and we kind of call you three the dream team on our podcast, was Sam and Max. And I think one of the things that makes it so unique is that it's primarily a jazz score.
Yeah.
Where did that idea come from?
I think my instant, doesn't that theme go bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum, bum? Isn't that right?
Exactly, yeah. That's Sam and Max.
That was my theme. And Sean Clark and Mike Stimley were the project leads on that. And basically Sean came to me, he said, look, this is a gumshoe thing. It's kind of a film noir-y sort of thing. I'm not sure whether he suggested something like a jazz thing or I just said film noir, gumshoes. It's got to sound like jazz. It's also an on the road aspect. It's called Sam and Max Hit the Road, right? So
yep, that's correct.
Kerouac and the beats, and really the post noir era is about the on the road kind of scene. What's when On the Road was written, and that's when you have films like The Wild Ones, Touch of Evil, a lot of scores that are jazz being something that symbolizes darkness.
Well, there's a lot of great solos throughout that soundtrack. Which one of you guys recorded the solos?
Solos. That's probably mostly me, but Clint did most of that score.
Okay.
Because I did the theme, and I did things like, Doug the Mole Man. And
that might be our favorite theme from that game.
That's the best track of the game.
Hey, so that's one of my favorite tracks of all time. I'd like to have real instruments do that one sometime.
Oh my gosh, we would love to hear that, Peter.
I used to play it with my band sometimes live.
Really? Do you happen to have a recording of that?
No, not one that I would want to scrub the bits of completely.
Oh, that's so cool.
But yeah, a lot of that, the more sort of, that's kind of my comfort zone is that dark, small ensemble jazz, hence Grim Fandango.
Yeah.
Hence a bunch of stuff I'm doing. I just...
Like Sly 3 even a little bit.
Sly 4 is even more that way.
Oh, really? Okay.
But anyway, it's very much, I really like that world, and like one of my favorite classes in school was African American history class. They brought players in, and there were still a lot of them around in those days that had really played in the era, and they could tell you stories and play on their instrument.
That's so cool.
That's great.
So yeah, that's kind of where that all came from, and the other thing is that Sam and Max are so American, right? And that's the American music.
Yeah.
And that's something I feel so much about you three is that you're such a strong example, especially in that time, of what it meant to be American game composers. You were embracing these American art forms, and I just thought that was so cool.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean that's probably one of our best gifts to the world is culture, is our version of pop culture,
Right.
And I think it's funny because rock and roll, of course, is American music too.
Well, speaking of rock and roll, there was an interesting choice to use the music of the Gone Jackals and Full Throttle.
Mm-hmm.
Did you work with the band, and could you talk a little bit about your time with that game?
Yeah. Tim Schaefer had been playing the game. Ben Throttle was walking around and getting on his bike and so on, and we were all looking at this. And he had been playing the game with a really mega huge Hollywood-based super grunge pop band whose name shall go unmentioned. That was just monstrously fat sounding. You know the sounds, right? Because this is 1993 or 94.
Okay.
So this was in the height of that big, heavy, very melodic-oriented, bands like Pearl Jam and that sort of thing were huge.
Or Soundgarden, yeah.
Exactly. So there was one of these bands of, on that level that, Tim was playing, and it was like, it worked so well. It was so righteous. Although, you heard this band, and the thing was that it kind of yanked it into the present because the band was so well known.
Sure.
Then there was another opportunity that came up, which was to license a wonderful band. Again, I guess it should go unnamed, but it's one of the great bands of the 60s. And it's not the one you think it is. It's even cooler than that. And these guys are personal favorites of mine. I have like everything they ever did. And
that's so cool.
But we'd play it in front of to the game. I go, this is a great licensing deal, guys, but it sure doesn't have the oomph of that you're looking for. The concept was so cool, and again, here's this specific band that everybody knows, and it's gonna take you right out of the Ben Throttle universe and put you in some weird zone.
Sure.
So then it just fell on me to say, okay, well then you need to find an unknown band.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, great. And I just I can't even remember how I sent out the feelers, but since I was playing in a band at the time, I probably asked some friends and people who I knew who might know biker bands kind of thing. And I got a flood of tapes, just a flood of tapes. And so I would go every night on the way to band rehearsal and pop these tapes into the remember tapes? Remember cassettes? Yeah.
I've heard of them. I've heard tell of them.
Yeah, they add a nice sort of sound of gas to everything. And they're good for at least 3 plays.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so I popped those in on the way to rehearsal, and some really wildly inappropriate stuff, and some stuff that was, and then a lot of stuff that was kind of like hitting the nail, like not hitting the nail on the head, but it was in the vibe. It was like these guys sound kind of like Lynyrd Skynyrd, but they're a little too country, and this doesn't have a twang.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, at some point I got a call from Keith, and I don't know how he had heard about it, but it's like, hey, I hear you guys are looking for a band, and my band plays, and we're like a heavy band, and I'm like, cool, come on over. Well, it kind of helped that he came over with the tape on a bike.
Oh my gosh, sold.
right, and he's he's kind of a wiry little guy, but he's super tough. And he comes up on this bike, hands me the tape, drives off. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll be listening to this tonight. And I had a pile of tapes, and I'm driving to rehearsal, and I put a tape in, and great, can't remember the name of the tune, but it's essentially the theme song.
Is it Legacy? The
yeah. Oh man, that's it.
That's how we all felt when we first turned that game on. We all had that same reaction that you had.
Yeah, I was just like, oh, this is righteous, And it's funny because I'm kind of conflating 2 memories in my mind, because one of them was that moment when I put that tape in. Another one was when I drove over the same bridge where I played Keith's music on, and the Hells Angels flew by me.
Oh my gosh.
I don't think those 2 happened at the same time, but it was a similar experience where you hear this big rumble like in the beginning of the game.
Oh yeah.
All these hogs go by you.
That's so cool.
It was pretty cool, and I got a real appreciation, which before that game I did 0 of, a real appreciation for bikes, and especially Harleys, because they're, in terms of performance, they're not really, maybe the best bike, but there's a certain vibe that you just cannot get with any other bike, and a certain sound, and like whenever I hear one, it's like musical now.
It's like a Fender Super Reverb or something.
I would say more like a Marshall stack.
That makes more sense, yeah.
Turn to 11. Anyway, so that's how that happened. That's how Keith's band got found, and I was sort of the liaison between the company and Keith and his players, and Keith and I did all the mixes together in various studios without the vocals, but that could work in the game. And
wow.
There was some other press events we did and sales of the record through the site, but it was really a very rewarding experience to find exactly the right sound for this game, then work with the music and put it into a format where it really, really worked with the picture and got what we wanted to happen.
That's so great. Well, kind of moving along, Grim Fandango is, I think, one of your most impressive soundtracks, and we imagine that it was a turning point for you as a composer. We're just speculating here. What does that soundtrack mean to you?
That pretty much means that. Grim Fandango was the second score we did at Lucasarts that had a significant level of live playing in it. I think the first was Outlaws.
Okay.
And experiencing writing for guys who really... And the other thing to keep in mind about Grimm is that was just at the time, it was the next pop music generation after that, where swing was suddenly this pop phenomenon, you know.
Yeah, like the Cherry Poppin' Daddies or...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you could go to the Mission. Do you guys... You're calling from the Midwest.
From St. Paul, Minnesota. Yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah, Minnesota. I know it well. Not that well, but actually I think one of the people who used to work for Tim came from Minnesota.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so do you know the Bay Area much?
Yeah, we do.
And do you know the Mission District in San Francisco?
No. At least I haven't.
The
I haven't
Mission
heard of
District it's still sort of slightly urban. It's before you get to the sort of outskirts.
Okay.
And it's heavily Latino and also starving artists. And it's
Sure.
right between two sort of more yuppie neighborhoods.
Okay.
Which is more like starving artists with money and outright people with money, which would be Potrero Hill and Noe Valley. And in between Potrero Hill and Noe Valley is the Mission District, which is much more rough and tumble. And if you were like 23 and wanted to go clubbing and you were not into an incessant kick drum, the Mission was where you wanted to go because you could have a $9 martini and see like the guy that plays for Tom Waits play with his little jazz combo.
Oh, wow.
That's so cool.
It was the totally hip place to go. And this is also when acid jazz was big. So
oh, yeah.
the Brown Fellinis were kind of the king of that scene. And so you had actual swing bands. You had more like bop funk bands like the Brown Fellinis.
Sure.
There was a lot of cross-current between jazz and rock and roll, and the center of it were these clubs in the Mission. So on any weekend, you could just walk from one place to another, see really cool bands with world-class players playing jazz or funky jazz. And then when you got hungry, you would stop into a taqueria, and there would be a mariachi band playing. That is the Grimm score.
That is so cool. So you were able to, I'm assuming, use some of those actual people.
Oh, yeah. All of them came from that scene. The mariachi band, came from a taqueria around the corner from Bruno's, which was one of the big clubs there. And, actually, I talked to the guy, and I was like, you guys are great. Do you read? He's like, no, but my cousin does, and he hands me his card. So I called his cousin, and that was the mariachi band. Bill Ortiz, who's the trumpet player, who's a big part of that score, played with a band called the Red Hot Skillet Lickers, who are still a going concern. Bill and the trombone player, Danny Armstrong, and then we had Paul Hansen, who's just a general badass around here. Plays electric bassoon is his main thing, but he played bassoon and clarinet on it.
Oh, wow.
Did he play any on Curse of Monkey Island? Because a lot of nice bassoon playing in that.
Any nice bassoon that you hear that's live on a Lucas product from the 90s is going to be Paul.
That's awesome.
And, Ralph Carney, who is one of Tom Waits' guys, that he played the slide clarinet stuff and the bass clarinet, all the really out there improvs with Ralph.
Huh.
That was a situation where, I learned how to deal with, not to have too many preconceived notions about how to make a piece when you're dealing with different sorts of musicians.
Right.
Yeah.
And Ralph, not a reader, but he could. It's like it's more like he didn't like to read, I think.
Exactly.
So he kind of strained and growled and winced through playing the parts. And then it was like, okay, Ralph, do what you would do,
Yeah.
So that really wild klezmer clarinet solo on Swanky Max, that's Ralph playing. And all that weird, squawky, low bass clarinet stuff is him. I just was so lucky to be in exactly the right spot to make that score. was a turning point because it was, the difference between writing for, no offense to Roland, but writing for Sound Canvas doesn't quite hold up to doing that.
Right. Well, just sort of to bounce off of that, what are, in your opinion, some of the differences between composing something like Psychonauts or Sly 3 nowadays versus something like Monkey 2 during your time at LucasArts?
Well, Monkey 2 was an interesting exercise because it was all about limitations, and you only had so many channels, and you had to be very careful about how many notes you were playing at once, and you had to fake things when you wanted to get more notes playing at once. So it was a lot of discipline involved, and then finally you needed to deal with the fact that it needed to sound good on different platforms. So, okay, here's what it sounds like. Okay, dude, you wrote this on the Sound Canvas, but it better sound good on a Sound Blaster.
Exactly. Which is what we played it with.
Right, exactly. And it's like, it's got to sound good to everybody. And we took a lot of care to make sure that it did. And we would really, Clint and Mike and I would wail on each other about that. Sort of have group reviews of the music to make sure that sounded good on the different cards. But, with Grimm, it was like the taste of, I see what it's going to be is you're going to do things because you want to, not because you have to.
Exactly.
And there's still budget constraints, of course, but that's always different on different projects that I work on, and it's always going to be that way, I think, because there's always going to be room for small things and big things in the world of interactivity.
Well, Psychonauts is a very interesting score, too. I feel like a lot of your solo scores use a lot of different world music influences.
Yeah, that was really interesting because pretty much anything Tim does has a level of emotional appeal that I find very compelling. And Psychonauts had that whole redemption theme going on in a different way than Grim Fandango did. So, there's this world of the mind. So the mind has no style, the mind has no genre. And so there were certainly a lot of styles and genres, and yet, generally speaking, I would say it was pretty Bernard Herrmann-y because of the Twilight Zone connection.
Sure. That's so awesome. Yeah, he's one of my favorite film composers.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to beat him.
We can try.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of another film composer, you've worked on so many different Star Wars games over the years. What has been your relationship with the music set forth by John Williams as far as how you've expanded upon that?
I've done all kinds of things with that, and probably one of the funnest things I did was Force Commander.
Oh, okay.
And Force Commander was really interesting because we had reached a point with John Williams by that time where there were only, at that time, 3 movies. And the 3 movies between them had maybe an hour and a half of music max. And there's not a whole lot you can do with, like, Yoda's theme or Princess Leia's theme and all that stuff. So then you have to throw that out and say that you've only got about an hour, for a game. You only have about an hour of useful music. And meanwhile, these games were like 40-hour experiences, and we were making a lot of them. So by the time Force Commander came around, I was kind of feeling like, we've kind of trodden down this path pretty many times, and we need to do something different. So Dave Levison and I kind of split the score and did it as a remix, sort of deconstructed Williams, where we took little tiny pieces of the John Williams music and turned it into completely different pieces with a heavy beat in some cases.
Did you have access to any of the Williams score when you were doing this sort of deconstruction?
Yes. We had all the original conductor scores, which are very hard to read.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know how the conductor could read those things, I'll be honest with you, because they're written very quickly under a deadline by the various orchestrators. And of course, Williams was conducting, so he knew all the music anyway. Probably the parts were copied better than the conductor scores.
Yeah.
So yes, we did, but I didn't necessarily find that all that useful for that particular project.
Sure.
For that particular project, it was more of a, like I say, a deconstruction of Williams. So you would hear little echoes of a piece that you recognize, and then would turn into some totally different theme that would either paste together by taking little sections of music or add an instrument. But I think what they found, to do later, which is like what Mark and Gordy did with Force Unleashed, it draws maybe a more refined balance between the dark world of games, the comparatively dark world of games, and the slightly more whimsical world that is really Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of circling back to your question, well, what was it like to be the John Williams? I was basically the John Williams editor in Lucasarts for all those years. And
that's so awesome.
I can't imagine a better way to go to school, really.
Yeah.
He really is, and I didn't go into it feeling this way, but he really is one of my very, very favorite composers. And
that is so
and
great.
Just the level of mastery and fine-tuning that he has over the connection between sound and human emotion it's just absolutely unmatched.
And he worked with Bernard Herrmann too.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. But being able to see, another thing that I think Mark Grisky also had this experience as well. You also have a little bit of a glimpse into sort of the creative process that goes on to make these scores, and part of that involved seeing not just the conductor's scores, but then what actually John Williams handed the orchestrator.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Those Mark worked with a lot. He worked with those more than I did, but I've seen them, and it's really interesting because everything is there. There's nothing isn't there, and it really changed the way I wrote in my sequencing stuff, because what I saw, there's nothing to do other than doublings.
Right. Yeah. See, I'm told that the way that he writes it, there's not much for the orchestrators.
Right. That way of working has basically, taught me don't leave anything up to the orchestrator that you don't absolutely have to,
Yeah.
So when I do bigger scores now, I really try to make sure that that the orchestrator's job's really boring.
That's great.
With some exceptions, because I get to work with pretty great orchestrators.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Well, I guess just to circle back a little bit to where we sort of started this interview, that iMuse technology was so revolutionary, and since then we've definitely made some other advancements in interactive game audio. Where do you see this going into the future?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I'd like to see some of the things that we did in 1998 or so implemented in some of the third-party development systems, which are sophisticated and wonderful systems.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's some basic stuff that still isn't being done in some of these really wonderful systems that I would like to see. I'd like to see them, for example, be much more intelligent about, there are many tempos, and one song need not stick to just one. And there are other time signatures besides 4/4.
4/4.
There really are. There's one called 3/4 that's actually been used a lot.
I've heard tell.
Yeah, and that's not so much that they can change time. And all this involves reading a MIDI tempo map making the MIDI tempo map as part of your basic development system. I don't know of systems that do that yet, although
Sure.
I may not. I think I'm a little out of date. I think I'm maybe 2 years out of date on that. So hopefully I'm wrong. So there's some basic stuff I'd like to see, but other than that, I think things have progressed pretty far, frankly. And when you're doing something like using Wise on an iPad game,
right?
That's pretty cool. And it means that people care about that sort of thing. I think probably if I were to predict where things are going to go on, say, large platform games, would be more Division of Labor rather than less. Having it be more just expected,
Yeah.
Our goal with iMuse was to give the impression that there was a pit orchestra playing to the game, and they were all just incredibly great improvisers, and a conductor is watching the game, and whenever something happens, the conductor just does something, and everybody just immediately...
Or it's like when someone's drunk or something.
Exactly.
Well, one thing that we talked about technically on our podcast, which you might find interesting, is when we were listening to those Dream Team soundtracks, one thing we thought was so interesting is that a lot of the music you guys didn't record to the grid. So you were hearing some of those natural, human, imperfect rhythms, and I think it added to the humor of those games.
Right,
at that time.
Yeah, I'm not a great big fan of quantization, and even now that my groove isn't as good as it used to be, but I do like to hear. It does depend, though. Sometimes you want the effect of mechanicalness. There's some scores that are very sort of almost self-consciously sequencer-based.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it's really fun. It's really sort of punchy and cute. And so I don't want to say that there's one way to skin that cat, but
sure.
Certainly I thought it was kind of interesting, kind of fun in some of those things in Monkey 2 the idea of playing a solo on an MT-32, it's kind of funny.
It is a lot of fun. It's very funny. It adds to the humor. I think the humor is another aspect of those soundtracks because obviously the games were very funny. But I think what is so unique about the music is that the music was able to elevate the humor of the game.
Well, no, thanks. That's definitely one of them. Part of it, too, is this is something that I learned from working later with Dev Madden on the early Sly games.
Sure.
Is that it's also important for the music sometimes to be the straight man.
Yeah.
Like to really play the emotion seriously, and not be comic book, but play the emotion seriously and make the seriousness be what's funny.
Yeah.
So, but, I mean, in the larger sense, I totally agree that, I just like music with humor. For some reason, I just always have. And something that's got a little wink and a nudge to it.
Is there another track from that era of yours that you remember that you're particularly fond of, other than the Doug the Mole Man theme?
We're talking Monkey 2?
Or just any game from that era, Sam & Max, Fate of Atlantis, or any track even.
Sure. The IRS guys in Day of the Tentacle.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
One of my tunes. And that was... that sort of got that little nyuk quality to it.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, it's sort of like seriously Spy in the way that Get Smart is seriously Spy. It's like,
right.
That it's funny.
When you guys were writing, you, Clint, and Michael, would you guys sometimes come up with ideas away from the technology? Like, would you just sort of come up with jams or something? And if so, who would play what instrument? I guess that's just something I'm kind of curious about.
We did play music together, and at that time I played in Mike's girlfriend's band besides playing in my own band.
Uh-huh.
But that was strictly extracurricular. No, composing was something that we sat down and did. Now, there wasn't always a direct connection between what was happening. Like I remember I would write tunes, and sometimes I would just write them down on a piece of paper, and I might or might not track them up. And then I might find, well, that doesn't really work in this situation.
Yeah.
So there was a little tune I did for Monkey 2 that just wasn't right. I'm not even sure that I came up, I had a place for it. I just started doing it. So it wasn't surprising that it didn't work in Monkey 2, but it ended up getting used in Monkey 4.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's
which song was that?
And see, now I'm not quite sure where it gets used, but it's like some map music. It's pretty prominent in the game. It's
okay.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So that didn't get into a game. It was basically like 8 years between the time that got written and the time it got put into a game.
That's crazy.
That must have felt so cool when it was finally used.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. Oh wow, now I got something I can do. Now I can finally do that tune. And not only that, it's going to have Paul McCandless playing on it too. That's awesome.
Wow.
And then there was also another one that I scrawled down during the Monkey stuff. And I was like, wow, this isn't Monkey at all. This is a gangster piece. But I kept hearing it, so I figured, well, I might as well write it down because I'll use it someday. And it turned out to be Swanky Max and Grim Fandango.
Oh, nice.
That's awesome.